Okay, Year 11. In today's lesson, we are looking at earthquakes, and we're going to be comparing earthquakes and LICs and HICs and looking at the impacts and the responses to these earthquakes. Now, in today's lesson, the work will be helpful for when you complete your test. In Friday's lesson, you will be completing a 9-mark question which relates to earthquakes and the effects and responses. So make sure you keep hold of your notes and make sure that if you're not sure of anything, you ask me questions if the video doesn't help answer them. So what are we going to be doing in today's lesson? We're going to be describing the differences between HICs and LICs. We're going to be comparing the impacts and responses to earthquakes and LICs. So the LIC we're going to be looking at is Nepal, and the HIC we're going to be looking at is Italy. And then we're going to be evaluating which countries are more effective at responding. So make sure you have open, please, the Word document or the PDF, depending on which you prefer to work on. And we're going to start with task 1. So task 1, where is Nepal and what happened in 2015? Well, on the 25th of April in 2015, at roughly 6:30 GMT, Nepal was struck with an earthquake that measured 7.9 on the Richter scale. When we're comparing earthquakes and looking at them, they will have a measurement between 0 and 10. 10 being the worst that it could measure on the Richter scale and 0 being the least. Okay, so it was caused by the Indo-Australian plate colliding with the Eurasian plate at a rate of 45 millimeters per year. And it happened just 15 kilometers beneath the ground, so it was quite a shallow earthquake, which means that the impacts were worse. So if you look at the images that you can see on the video, the image on the right is showing you a map. So you've got a world map, and then also we've zoomed into Nepal. So we're looking at where Nepal is. So when you're describing its location, you need to make reference to the fact that it's in the northern hemisphere, so it's north of the equator. The continent you find in Asia, to be a bit more specific, so it's north of India. You could make reference to the fact that it's just north of the Tropic of Cancer. If you wanted to be really specific, you would say it's roughly 26 to 31 degrees north. So I'll just write these down for you. So it's 26 to 31 degrees north. So they're the lines of latitude. And it's 80 to 89 degrees east. So they're the lines of longitude. So all you need to do for this bit is just simply describe where it was, and if you are making notes on paper, it might be worth writing down the facts at the top. So when it happened, 2015, its Richter scale measurement was 7.9, and the plates that were involved within this. And then once you've done that, we're going to move on to task 2. Task 2 then is looking at the impacts and responses to this earthquake. Now, it's really important that we know the difference between an impact and a response. So an impact is what happens as a result of something. So if it was raining outside, Miss Briggs would get wet. A response to that would be to maybe put on a coat with a hood, or to use an umbrella, or maybe to just avoid going out if it was raining. So that's the difference between an impact and a response. A response can only happen if an impact has occurred. So the first thing you need to do is decide which are impacts and which are responses, and then we need to go a little bit more specific. So let's have a look at some examples together. So I'm going to highlight my impacts as, actually I'm just going to put I or R for this section because I'm going to use colours later on. Okay, so the first one says 9,000 people died and 20,000 people were injured. So these are talking about the impact, and they happened as a result of this earthquake. Now we need to be a little bit more specific. We need to think about, is this a primary impact or is this a secondary impact? So a primary impact is something that has been caused by the shaking of the earth. So it's something that's happened because of the earthquake. So it could be that a building has collapsed. It could be that there has been, like, electricity and water supplies have been cut off. So do we think people dying and being injured is a primary impact or a secondary impact? Well, it depends what's caused them to die or to be injured. Generally, it's because the buildings have collapsed, or they've been cut off from water or food supply, so they may have died from waterborne diseases such as cholera. So the fact that people have died and are injured is mostly because of the primary impacts, so this would go down as a secondary impact. So let's look at another one to see whether it's a secondary impact or a primary impact. Okay, so we've got one example here. 7,000 schools were destroyed, and the schools would have been destroyed because of the shaking of the earthquake. So I would say that that was a primary impact. Now, if we were thinking about what would be a secondary impact of the schools being destroyed, well, if there were children within the school, that could have led to deaths or injuries, which would be a secondary impact. It means that people are not able to be educated, which is also a secondary impact. So the schools being destroyed is a primary impact that's occurred as a result of the ground shaking. And then the secondary impact are what happens because of that. So once you've gone through and found all the impacts and you've decided whether they are primary impacts or secondary impacts, you then need to do the same for responses. So first of all, let's find a response and then let's decide whether we think it's an immediate response or a long-term response. So this one here says that the Red Cross set up temporary shelter for 225,000 people. So they've set this up immediately, and the reason that they have done this is to try and save lives. So immediate responses, they try to save lives and they try to keep the injuries and the death toll to a minimum. So this would be an example of a response, and it would be an immediate response. It's not for the long term. It wouldn't be very helpful if they did it months after the earthquake. It needs to happen as fast as possible to try and keep the impacts to a minimum. So let's compare this then to this example that says the UK raised 126 million US dollars to provide emergency aid to the worst hit areas. So this is a response, and it's relying on other countries around the world. So it would still go down as a response, and that money could have been used for anything. The money could have been used in the long term to try and help rebuild the economy, rebuild the infrastructure. But it says here it was to provide emergency aid. So the emergency aid could have been food parcels, it could have been shelter, it could have been blankets or water. So these are all examples of another country providing aid as an immediate response. So let's try and find an example of a long-term response. So what they did in the future to try and ensure that the next time an earthquake occurs in Nepal, the impacts won't be as bad. So here we can see that the stricter building controls in the future were put in place in Nepal. So this is still a response, but it's not going to help them in the immediate term. It's not going to save lives for the earthquake that happened in 2015, but it's going to save lives in the future. So by making the building stricter, so being built from sturdier materials, will ensure that the impacts for the next earthquake won't be as bad. So this is an example of a long-term response. Okay, so make sure you complete all of this for task 2, and then we'll move on to task 3. Task 3 then, you can see, is very similar to task 1, but we're now going to be looking at Italy, which is an example of our HIC. So in 2009, in April, an earthquake measured 6.3 on the Richter scale. So if we're comparing this to the earthquake that happened in Nepal, it wasn't as strong. So the one that happened in Nepal was 7.9, and the epicenter was 7 kilometers northwest of the town. So it was relatively close to the city, which meant that there would have been possibly more people injured. And this was because of the Eurasian plate and the African plate. So when you're describing Italy's location, you need to make sure you make reference to the continent. So we find it in Europe, the fact it's found in the northern hemisphere, And then you might use this figure on the left to be a bit more specific about where it was within Italy. So it's called the L'Aquila earthquake because of its location to L'Aquila. Okay, so this is task 3. Task 4 then, you need to do the same thing that you did for Nepal, but you're doing this for Italy. So you need to go through and decide whether you think the statements are impacts or responses. So let's do some examples together. 300 people were killed, 1,500 were made injured, and 67,000 were made homeless. These are all impacts. So then you would decide whether you think it was a primary impact, it happened because of the earthquake shaking, or you think it's a secondary impact. Moving on then, let's have a look at another one. Hotels provided shelter for 10,000 people. So they were providing shelter to try and keep the injuries down and the death toll down. So this would be an example of a response, and it would be a short-term or immediate response to try and save lives. This one here is a little bit more difficult to decide what it is, and it says the EU gave $552 million to help rebuild L'Aquila. Now it doesn't say what they use that money for, so you might choose to have it as a response, and you might just not decide whether it's immediate or long term because it's not specific enough. Let's have a look at a few more then. 40,000 tents were given out. So this is going to be a response, and it's going to happen immediately. It's to try and prevent the amount of people that are homeless, try and prevent the amount of people that are living in unsafe and unsanitary conditions, which will try and reduce death rates or the amount of injuries. So once you've gone through task 4 and you've decided whether they're an impact or a response, we're then going to be moving on to the final task. And this allows you to compare all the information from task 1 to 4, and this will help you answer the exam question which you will do in Friday's lesson. So task 5 then, you need to compare Nepal to Italy. And what we have here is a disaster profile. So a disaster profile is a description and analysis of different characteristics during an event. And you will see there are a variety of lines, and each line is talking about a different category. So you have to use the information from tasks 1 to 4 to plot an I for Italy and an N for Nepal on each line. So for example, if we're thinking about the magnitude for Nepal was 7.9 on the Richter scale. So it would be closer to the 10 than it would be the 0. So if we plot a 5 in the middle, it would roughly be about here. So I would do an N and then a circle. Italy, however, was not as powerful on the Richter scale, but it was still a 6.3. So it's going to be past the halfway point roughly here. So you don't have to add on specific information, you just plot the I or the M. Similarly, let's do another example together. So this one says the time of the day, and we're talking about the Greenwich Mean Time. So Nepal's earthquake happened at 6:30 in the morning, so it's going to be before the halfway point, before midday. So Nepal will be roughly here. And then Italy happened just after this at about 10 to 11, so Italy would go roughly there. So hopefully by the end of this activity, you will have a much more clearer comparison between the two earthquakes. Once you've completed tasks 1 to 5, please make sure that you submit all of your work onto the assignment that has been assigned to your class. And if you have any questions when completing the activities, please send me a message on It's Learning. Make sure you hold on to your activities for today's lesson and yesterday's lesson, as on Friday you will be completing a quiz that will look at the work from this week in addition to the work that you did before half term, which relates to tectonic hazards.